everyone, welcome to Political Capital, another week with all the latest in BC politics. It's a very busy time out there. We just had the provincial budget drop. We have the legislature in session. There's lots of international news going on as well. Make sure when you're subscribing to us, you're checking us out on Check Plus, where you've got all the archived episodes for free available for you to watch, and subscribing on your favorite podcast stream so you get the latest from us usually Friday afternoon. We're recording Sundays on Check TV. We're going to bring in the pod squad here, the original crew. Jillian, Katy, Maclean are here to talk about the week in BC politics. We're going to start with the BC budget. It landed this week. It spends big in areas of healthcare for the pandemic, disaster relief, setting up a year-round wildfire service funding, amongst other things. The books are not balanced. BC is projected to run a deficit of almost $5.5 billion. In terms of things ordinary people might care about, we have a move to provide child care at an average of $20 a day by the end of this year, not the $10 that was promised twice by the NDP in elections, and mainly only because the federal government loaded up a dump truck full of money in their election run last year and dumped $3 billion into that file. But a win is a win. It doesn't have to be pretty. It can be ugly and still be a win on that file. There's also money for old growth, ambulance wait times, homelessness, all that sort of stuff. So let's go around. Good, bad, blah. What do we think of the provincial budget? Katy, why don't we start with you?
Starting with the good from a comms perspective, I think excellent work as always from finance and the government communications shop. Like as it's always been under successive administrations, I thought the materials, the releases, the backgrounders, the PowerPoint decks were very clear. They were professional and easy to find, and that's important, especially if you're a journalist writing about the budget, Rob. In terms of the branding, I thought it was kind of funny. Stronger together. That's Hillary Clinton's 2016 slogan, and then it was borrowed by Trump in 2020. We always used strong as BC Liberals, particularly in our campaigns. It's a term that pulls really well, so I wasn't really surprised.
Well, Stronger BC was the election platform and the economic plan. So Stronger Together, I guess, is a take on that, maybe. But yeah, good point.
Yeah. On the budget itself, like I thought Peter Millibar, BC Liberal MLA Peter Millibar, his immediate critique was thoughtful and it was accurate. Like when he said there's an enormous difference between action and delivering, like on issues like affordable housing supply, increasing rents, the overdose crisis. Like these are three areas in particular where we've heard a lot of promises from the government, but we honestly haven't seen many tangible results. And in fact, I would argue that all three of those areas are in fact getting worse. I think as life continues to get more expensive and politicians, both provincially and federally, continue to raise this, these are three key areas where Kevin Falcon and the opposition BC Liberals can really capitalize. And ultimately, I think it would be very arrogant and foolish for the NDP to underestimate their ability to do just that.
Jillian, what did you think of that? I mean, affordability is top of mind right now. Everyone's talking about it. I don't know if the budget hits on that or other areas that jumped out at you.
Well, I think that the government rightly really wanted this budget to be about responding to the climate-caused disasters that we in the last year. For me, that was the biggest standout. I think this is the first budget, and I think this is the best thing to come out of it, that really proactively addresses the need for climate adaptation. We talked a lot about that on this show as those events were unfolding, about how government had all of these reports about the need to, shore up dikes and better make communities more resilient in the face of wildfires. But they never made those investments, and that meant that we are spending more and experiencing greater costs during these disasters when they hit. So it's great to see that there is a move in that direction, and I really hope that that's permanent. But yeah, I think Katy's right. There's a lot of big affordability measures in particular that are missing. The renter's rebate that we've been promised for 5 years now, I think it is. Free contraception that they promised in the election. I think probably what's happening is that we're going to get these closer to the next election, but I think that's going to be a bit of cold comfort for people that are trying to pay bills in the intervening months and years until the government decides that it's politically advantageous to actually roll those things out.
You do get the impression. I mean, I think on climate, You got to give the NDP government a lot of points. I mean, they have a plan. They have a second plan that is pretty widely considered to be at least okay. They pump money into that file in every budget. They're putting money into the mitigation file, and whether it's enough and whether municipalities can use it in the right way, at least it's there. They're certainly responsive on the climate file. They get a lot of emphasis on it, a lot of press conferences, a lot of money. So I think you're right. That part of it fits into something they've been trying really hard to do. Maclean, anything jump out at you?
Well, okay, and at least it's there is a pretty high bar. But there's good things and bad things in the budget. I think the single biggest thing that jumped out at me as a positive was making the BC Wildfire Service a year-round service that in the off season will focus on prevention. You'd be forgiven for thinking, if you're watching this, that the BC Wildfire Service was already a year-round institution because it's in the news so much for all the wrong reasons. Hopefully, this will help avoid some of the disasters we've seen in the last couple of years. On the bad, the issues that BC is struggling most with sometimes struggled to get enough attention in this budget. I'm talking about the overdose crisis and home prices. The overdose crisis is still kind of lumped in, sort of, with health and especially with mental illness and the homelessness problem. The numbers say that's not necessarily who's dying, and the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions is still kind of underfunded and overwhelmed by this problem. And adding more communications and program staffers in the ministry is not the solution. And on home prices, it's you can almost just start laughing. In the ministry's budget documents themselves, they point to rising interest rates as going to be the thing that will most clamp down the increase in home prices. Not decrease them, but slow the increase. Which is fine, but two problems. It's not something the province controls, and the budget also listed rising interest rates as a risk to the overall economic outlook because it makes deficit spending and debt more unaffordable. And so if this is the best thing coming down the pipe for home prices, it also might damage the provincial coffers. And it's hard to see if this is just a mixed blessing or just bad.
Yeah, well, we've been asking the finance minister for years now whether this government is as addicted to the money from real estate sales, which is called the property transfer tax, as the last government. And the revenue that comes in from property transfer tax in this current year is $3.2 billion. I think it's more than the government earns on property taxes for people who own homes. And that balance is so out of whack. It is a good question, Maclean. We keep asking, is it a risk to the budget to lower housing prices and sales and that revenue that comes in? And does government really want to do that? It says it does, but it hasn't done anything to do it. And how do those two things kind of collide? Because that money, $3 billion, is propping up all sorts of services in government right now. And without it, things would be a little bit darker indeed. Katy, let me ask you one more question. I just want to go to you on this because you've helped craft budgets and governments in budgets. A midterm budget, right smack in the middle of a government's term, is it generally kind of like meh, like there's no incentive to really do anything? Or how do we view that kind of timing of this budget, do you think?
Yeah, that I actually made a similar comment to an MLA just a couple days ago. I was like, this wasn't really surprising to me for a midterm budget. Like, and it almost follows kind of a BC Liberal formula. You've got the one or two big splashy announcements that usually come with a higher price tags, and then you try to be as balanced as possible to a variety of different demographics. Like for the overdose crisis, and we could talk about the pitfalls of their approach on this ad nauseum. But you saw deliberately in the passage, they shared a story about somebody who had found recovery from addiction, and then they also included the work that they were doing on safe supply. So you can see these little announcements here and there that are intended for a very specific audience so that the government can say they are doing something. But to Jillian's point and to your point, yes, like midterm budgets are a little less exciting. And I think we are going to see the real goodies rolled out in a pre-election strategy, which I've said before will be far before the date in 2024 when we're supposed to have one.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. That's some other show. It is an interesting debate on when we're going to have the next election and whether the next budget is going to be the big budget or not. So one of the reasons when you're covering a budget, the government tries to explain everything in 3-year terms. Like, look at how much money we're putting into something over 3 years. And you're like, no, I don't. Look, next year it's all going to change, right? Next year you're going to blow this thing up. So I only want to know how much you're doing this year, because you're right. Next year's budget could be an election budget, and everything we saw this year would be gone. I want to move on to another budget topic. There were 2 question periods this week focused on an issue, a smaller issue in the budget that nonetheless had government on the ropes, and it's a change to hold back pay for ministers. And basically in the past, for many, many years, ministers have had 10% of their salary held back and not given to them if the budget is in deficit. And this budget quietly made a change to remove that. And I think it's because the last 2 budgets were in deficit. This year's probably going to be in deficit. The next 3 might be in deficit, and ministers are kind of tired of losing that money. So the government changes it. It's not a lot. It's about $5,500 a minister a year, 20 grand over the course of this year in the 3-year budgetary cycle. But it is kind of a question, kind of a political risk, I think, for the government to have done this. They've been on the ropes. Their defenses have been not great about it. Does this matter? Is it a issue that's too inside the beltway? Is it not even an issue at all? Why don't we go around on that, Maclean?
2 things on that. The first is these things do matter because they're relatable. You say $5,000 is not a huge amount of money. I mean, yes, in the grand scheme of things, but I would certainly notice a $5,000 difference in my annual pay. And it's an amount of money that people understand, they can point to. It's not like a $5 billion deficit. It's a lot like, $10 orange juice. It's like where I'm entitled to my entitlements. These things aren't necessarily fatal in and of themselves, but they are illustrative to the public mind about things like entitlement. And for a government to sort of backdoor it in and act like they're being a little coy about it is the kind of thing the public notices and goes, I don't like that. And the problem the NDP had was not even necessarily removing the holdback. It was the justifications they gave, which was not, it's bad policy, et cetera, and so forth. It makes things more complicated. It was literally, this is the difference between businesses getting COVID supports. This is the difference between having vaccine clinics or not. These are not my words. I'm quoting the finance minister near verbatim. If you are telling the public that a $5,000 difference in your pay is the difference between providing life-saving services or not, you are the one planting the questions about your motivations. This is not something the opposition has done. This is entirely a self-inflicted wound, and pointing to the justification is entirely appropriate.
That was one of the worst explanations I've ever heard on any subject in the legislature. That idea that taking $5,000 a year from a minister encourages them to cut, and by cutting, we wouldn't have any vaccine clinics. And I just thought, man, talk about making things worse. I don't know how that explanation made it through the communications strategists, the issues managers, and the political staff, and landed in the finance minister Selena Robinson's question period binder. But good grief.
How insulted would you be if you're Adrian Dix and you've just heard your colleagues say that if it weren't for that $5,000, the pandemic would have gone much worse? It's terrible. It speaks to motivation. And I don't believe this is true, but again, these are their words.
Yeah, no, I imagine it's probably a misspoken attempt to jam a bunch of question period points together, but it certainly didn't help. Jillian, anything jump out at you in this? Maclean mentioned orange juice. I remember Bev Oda's $16 orange juice she expensed as international aid minister in 2012 turned out to be this massive issue that caused her to have to resign because the public doesn't understand a $70 billion provincial budget. It's just too astronomically abstract. But a $16 glass of orange juice, a $5,000 raise or bonus or holdback for a minister, maybe they get that.
Yeah, I think, it was interesting. I actually didn't know about this policy until this happened this week. And reading about the history was really interesting. It was actually a Hail Mary kind of move from the NDP government of the 90s to try to sort of salvage their reputation on the economy when they were facing criticism. And they ended up losing government anyway. So it was created for political reasons. And it's not surprising that now it's, becoming sort of a political cudgel. I agree. I don't think that it's good policy because deficit spending and those decisions that government makes have to be made in the current economic context, which is, that's all the government had to say. I think, the public supported extra spending during the pandemic, and I think that they support it to get out of the crisis and to recover and to transition the economy in the ways that have become very clear that we need to do. And they should have just said that. I think, when politicians are in the legislature, especially during session, things get very partisan, very heated, and often, unfortunately, these debates devolve to the sort of crudest possible partisan terms. And it's unfortunate because I think that this is a time where we really need cool-headed conversations about these difficult choices. And that was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. Katy, what do you think?
First and foremost, I think it's quite jarring that we live in a world where a conservative minister had to resign in disgrace over an overpriced glass of orange juice in the UK, by the way, where things are much more expensive. And yet we have a prime minister who has worn blackface more times than he can recall, and he still sits at the head of state. So just wanted to
all right.
throw that nugget in there.
Really, okay.
Back to this issue. Back to
Katy brought her shoehorn today.
Look.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree, Rob, with your sentiment that in the piece that you wrote for the Orca and in Von Palmer's piece for the Vancouver Sun, like to suggest, as the finance minister did, and as Maclean just laid out, that this was a choice between giving themselves a raise and punishing British Columbians with draconian cuts is patently false, and it's political spin at its best. Sure, it could have been an accident. It also could have been what is kind of affectionately known as dome disease amongst political staff. It's when people in politics get caught in this legislature bubble, which is filled with like self-congratulatory nonsense and often leads to political spin that is just not believable by normal people who aren't in that 24/7 news cycle. So we could have seen a case of that here. I think it's also, this is lazy. Like it is government's job to eventually balance the budget, and we're not really seeing a credible plan to do so here. And so to me, it was really jarring to see, the NDP basically justify a pay increase while thumbing their nose at British Columbians who are struggling to make ends meet. And balancing a budget is tough, but it can be done. And so look to Alberta. They also have a legislative ministerial holdback, which has been imposed for the last couple of years, and they just balanced their budget for the first time since 2014. And I know there's an argument out there that it's simply oil prices. It's not. Under the NDP in Alberta, the NDP had hiked spending by about 4% a year, and at that rate, they would have a $6 billion deficit this year, and that's with current energy prices factored in. So I'm a big advocate for balanced budgets because it matters. Debt servicing costs matter. We're paying about, I think, $2.9 billion annually. This is an interest to foreign banks. That is money that could go to building schools, hospitals, and other infrastructure. So thoughtful, careful spending matters, and it has real consequences. And so for that not to be factored in while the NDP justifies a pay increase is just, it's beyond to me. And if the BC Liberals, if they're smart, they should go hard on this.
Yeah,
as they did in QP.
It's a bit of a gift to them. I'm sure they'll take it out for a ride for a while and see where it goes because it fits into everything else they're doing. But yeah. Let's move on to a grab bag. We only have a few minutes left here. I just wanted to start off just mentioning that we have a new minister of a new forest and lands ministry, which is kind of hived off from the other ministries as part of the budget. It's just sort of happening as we record the show here. So Josie Osborne, the municipal affairs minister, is this new lands minister, and Nathan Cullen becomes the municipal affairs minister. Not really sure how big a deal this is outside the Beltway. There's a whole probably explanation for it that we'll get into in a future show, but just wanted to mention that. Let's go around the table here on anything that anyone else sort of had this week with just a few minutes left. Jillian, go. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously everybody's eyes were glued to international news this week with what's happening in Ukraine, and we're starting to see it play out in terms of our economy and our budgets. As Katy mentioned, energy prices are skyrocketing after falling for many years, and kind of throwing a wrench in conversations about the need to transition the economy off fossil fuels and get more serious about climate change. I think that for me, what's really interesting is how we're starting to see the threads of this issue be so connected. I think for so long we've looked at this issue as sort of climate change as a siloed issue, and we're seeing now how it's related to international security, how it's related to supply chain, how our supply chains were impacted by climate change earlier this year as well. And just how important it is to sort of take a holistic approach when we're talking about these issues and not get caught in this reactionary cycle of chasing commodity prices, because it leads to more volatility. And I think it's going to be a really interesting one to watch to see how Canadian governments respond in the next couple of weeks and months.
Okay, interesting point. Maclean, what's on your mind? 30 seconds for you.
Okay. Yesterday, the Green Party and the BC Liberals, but led by the Greens in this case, responded to a motion in the House, which is very unusual in this case, about parliamentary committees. And to make a long story short, they reiterated the case yet again that the government really needs to reconvene the All-Party Committee on Health. Because there is an overdose crisis going on out there, and the government cannot credibly say that things are going well. And also, an all-party committee on health was extremely useful during the pandemic. There's absolutely no reason not to solicit ideas and cooperation from all parties in the legislature, and yet they just simply won't do it. I encourage anyone who's watching to go ahead and watch or read the transcript. It's a fascinating thing.
Okay, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure how much it would help the overdose crisis, but it's certainly one that keeps coming up as an idea of how to get better ideas on what to do. Katy, 30 seconds for you. What's on your mind on the grab bag this week?
Yeah, playing off what Maclean just said, I do think that all-party committee would be useful. And I say that because Alberta has just convened a legislative committee to talk about safe supply. They are bringing in leading global experts, including I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, Zhao Gayo. He is basically the drug czar behind the Portugal model, which is what progressives consider the gold standard in addiction care. So we do need to have these important discussions, because what we're doing now is not working. And this is an area that perhaps doesn't require more money, but does require innovative policy. And so I fully support the idea of an all committee on health being reconvened.
There's an interesting column in the Vancouver Sun by Daphne Brahm this week looking at some of the testimony so far to that Alberta committee, the issue of safe supply and that type of thing. So I encourage people to read that. All right, panel, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching and listening to us. We'll be back next week with all the latest in BC politics on Political Capital.